In the 90s and early 2000s, Europe was harvesting the fruits of process of unification and enlargement, growing bigger in population, space, and spreading its core values. Geopolitical challenges seemed to have lower impact until the 2008 war in Georgia and world economic crisis. Series of dramatic events in the past decade and a half, from Arab Spring to migrant crisis, from Brexit to wars in Europe's East and Middle East, all led to a series of serious blows to the project of strong, united Europe. Is Europe able to respond to the present regional and global challenges? Looking for answers in next panel are David Donoghue, Distinguished Fellow of Overseas Development Institute, Rob Dixon, Director of International Affairs, National Security Secretariat, United Kingdom, Vessela Tcherneva, Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, René Troccaz, Special Envoy for the Western Balkans of the French Republic, who will join us a bit later, and moderator of this panel is Philippe Reeker, Chair of the Wilson Center Global Europe Program.
Well, good morning. Dobro jutro. We're gathered here with distinguished panelists in Belgrade at the Belgrade Security Conference, 1/4 of the way through the 21st century. And we're here to discuss broadly in defense of humanity. Indeed, in 2024, over half of humanity had the opportunity to vote in elections that included the EU, several EU member states, the UK, and other European countries, of course, and of course, the United States, as we discussed last night, had a historic election. While each of these votes are unique exercises in the democratic process, it's clear that geopolitics is back. A resurgent Russia, China, the BRICS, MAGA in America, and in the middle of it is Europe. Geopolitics, of course, have doomed Europe in the past, but in different contexts. We recall that out of the ashes of World War II came ideas, experiments, and institutions. NATO, the OSCE, the European Union. An unprecedented era of stability, security, and prosperity. But now questions are asked. Dobrodošli. I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists to comment on the theme of this panel, in fact. What does it mean to you? How would you define Europe as surviving and thriving? And we'll begin with David.
Thank you very much, Phil, but it's a great pleasure to be here in Belgrade at the BSC conference. I think the title of the conference is inspired because really it is one would like to think that Europe could thrive. I personally am a bit gloomier. I think that we will manage, we will muddle through, we will be able to find opportunities, but we are also facing enormous challenges, both externally and internally within the European Union. So I would personally veer more towards Europe surviving, much as I would like it to actually thrive, but I think it's more likely that we will achieve a suboptimal result. The challenges within Europe are obvious if you look at the position which Europe is trying to take on some of the big geopolitical challenges we're facing at the moment, whether it is the Ukraine conflict, whether it is the Middle East developments. Europe can just about forge a unity, but only just about. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'm just trying to be realistic. Externally, we have fresh challenges in the face of a new US administration, which is likely to be isolationist and protectionist. That will have both political and economic consequences for Europe. We therefore have a vacuum which perhaps Europe could fill, but on the other hand, others, and I think of China and Russia, will in various ways try to fill that vacuum. So, in a sense, we have an uphill struggle ahead of us, let's wait and see. Europe stands for democracy, the rule of law, all the values which the video showed a moment ago. In a way, if Europe can't do it, nobody can do it. So we have to pick up the various challenges presented, but it won't be easy.
Thank you. Vessela, surviving or even thriving? Your thoughts?
The fact is that we don't know what is going to happen. We're at a inflection point in time. There are such moments in history where everything is possible, everything is open. And for the sake of the balance, as one would say here in Belgrade, we, I think, can also have another scenario, another future. I believe Europe can actually mobilize in the face of all these challenges that you mentioned. Some of them are real threats, some of them are lethal threats. I believe the first step is going to be on European defense. There will be, I think, a significant leap forward, including in cooperation with the UK, which I believe is very important. There will be, and there is already, a program for economic security. The European Commission has been preparing for possible tariffs, additional tariffs from the US. So this is going to mobilize it also to think more in a more focused way about China, I believe. The big question mark is obviously about Ukraine and how we're going to perform there. And I think this is the most immediate challenge. So probably the key to the answer, who of us is right, lies somewhere in the next weeks in Ukraine.
It's interesting you brought up the point about relations with the UK, which reminds us that the question of Europe is one of geography and also one of institutions. I have to remind people in the United States frequently, and I even found this living in London, that you have to define Europe. The UK is still part of Europe. There is no doubt. Geography matters, but it is no longer part of the European Union. So when we say Europe, Rob, what do you think? Survive or even thrive from a UK perspective?
I think what I'd say is that in addition to the questions about thriving and surviving, there is for the new UK government an ambition to reset and reconnect, not only with Europe, but also globally after what has been a pretty tumultuous few years. And a lot of that is driven by the headwinds that we are facing, whether it's economic, that real challenge of trying to build growth across Europe, including in the UK, great power competition, which, in a lot of this discourse, sometimes we say great power competition, geopolitical competition is back. It's never gone away. It's 1,000 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's 400 plus days since the war broke out in the Middle East again. But it's 10 years since the annexation of Donbass and Crimea. It's 16 years since the invasion of Georgia. This competition has not gone away. I think what has changed in the last few years is a Western realization that this competition has not gone away, or indeed that it is, in policy terms, it's now a challenge we have to wrestle with again, in the like of which we haven't had to face. So in the context of that backdrop, geopolitical competition, war in Europe, and interconnectedness between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security challenges, which is very live and very real, these are forcing us all to think about our connections globally, including for us, for a new UK government in Europe. Facing also things like the challenges of illegal migration, as I say, growth, and indeed the challenge of climate change. So we need to find new ways of working, new ways in which we can engage with our European partners, both with the EU and indeed bilaterally, in order to be able to respond, to be able to get beyond some of the political divides that have existed over the course of the last few years and intensify our pragmatic, realist, and enlightened ways of cooperating on all of those shared challenges, whether it be from Ukraine, through migration, through to the Middle East, or indeed what is going to happen with China over the coming period.
René, President Macron himself was quoted not that long ago as saying, Europe can die. Now, he said NATO was brain dead at one time too, and perhaps that motivated NATO to take a new look, to come up with a new strategic concept, to have a forward-looking review process. What are your thoughts as a Frenchman, as a French official, on the idea of Europe surviving or thriving?
Europe will survive, and Europe has to live and to get stronger. You mentioned all the challenges. We are not naive. We know them, they are ahead of us, and we have to find answers. Here we have different circles in order to address these challenges. As France, of course, apart from our crucial national interests, the way we see the European continent, we have this European circle of the European Union. We have, of course, to make it stronger, more coherent, and this is why we have the ambition to reform it, to make it more efficient and to be able to address both its citizens and its major goals in the world. Second, we have the other countries of the continent. Recently, we all met in Budapest at the conference, the political conference on political community in Europe.
EPC.
EPC. And of course, I'm thinking here of countries like the United Kingdom, our British friends, partners. There are many other countries which are not members of the European Union, but we are all in a way facing the same challenges. And namely, when it comes to stability, security, there are no borders in our continent for that. So we have to be coherent and collectively try to address these threats. Once we are here in Belgrade, let me, once it's my job also, the Balkans, say one word about this region, this sub-region of the so-called Western Balkans, to say in this new context of the war in Ukraine, of a new US administration in Washington, of things which are moving, changing, a lot of conflicts in the Middle East everywhere, how important it is for us to follow the European path of enlargement to the Western Balkans and, of course, to Serbia. This is also part of the global game of bringing more stability to our continent.
I think that's a very good segue to the next subject I wanted to bring up, which is enlargement of the EU. Certainly, US policy toward Europe has included the concept of EU enlargement, but the United States is not a member of the EU, which we sometimes have to remind our friends, particularly in this region. We agreed at the beginning of this century that the solution to the challenges in the Western Balkans, the wars that struck people as a regressive part of history in the 90s, the solution to that was to help these countries emerge democratic, sovereign, territorial integrity, and integrated as democracies into the institutions like NATO and the EU. I think in many ways we've done our part from the United States perspective, but there's some skepticism about EU enlargement. These countries have waited a long time. Generations of young people have heard that we are European, we will be in the EU, and yet it seems further off. Maybe you want to respond, René, and we'll turn to Vessela. How real, in the light of these new developments, do you think EU enlargement is? And is this something that will just continue to have its goalposts moved, as many countries have experienced? Or is it something that we can see concrete steps on in the near future?
We have to compare this enlargement, this new wave of enlargement of the European Union to the Western Balkans, with all the nuances and differences between the countries of the region, with the previous waves of enlargement of the European Union. Take, for instance, 2004, where we integrated at once 10 countries, from Estonia to Cyprus, through Poland, Czech Republic, and others. It was a huge enlargement. And, okay, it was not easy, but we made it. And we made it successfully. Same thing for the previous waves of enlargement. I'm here thinking of, for instance, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and others. And basically the idea was what? Coming to Europe, becoming a member of the European Union means freedom, means, for some of the countries, prosperity, stability. Now, in this case, you reminded very rightly that the countries of the Western Balkans are now waiting for more than 20 years. It's too long. We have to speed up, and the reason for that is precisely because war is back on our continent, the war in Ukraine. So, new, major, crucial, dramatic challenges, such as the war in Ukraine, new answers for the region, and we have to speed up and to push for stability. I think these countries we owe to these countries the enlargement and to become full members of the European Union.
I know that will be well received here in Belgrade. Vessela, there's been a lot of talk about Ukraine and its European, as in EU, perspective, because Ukraine is a European country. But yet, if the EU has had trouble taking in Montenegro with 600,000 people, is it really possible that a country the size of Ukraine can move as rapidly as is suggested into the EU? What are your thoughts on the enlargement question?
Since I'm not an official, I can I could probably be a bit more blunt. But I think Ukraine actually did a great service to enlargement because it made it possible again. There was energy, momentum, there was enthusiasm. Interestingly, so that enthusiasm also transferred to the Western Balkans, to the way Europeans view the Western Balkan enlargement. It really looked much more doable, even easy peasy, people would say, you know. And now we find out that our view of enlargement actually goes in parallel to the successes or failures on the field in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So the moment Ukraine started getting bogged down militarily, Europeans became more wary of the perspective of enlargement in general. On the other hand, this whole energy that came from that initial impulse, I think did not go in vain, because now we talk a lot more about the geopolitical enlargement versus the merit-based enlargement. I am afraid this is a dilemma that is not very helpful, because it gives the wrong signal to people in the Balkans that they can get in simply for geopolitical reasons. That the Ukraine train is just going to pass by, they will jump on it, and there is nothing really needed to do there.
The homework is still important.
And I think this is a big misunderstanding, because the more European publics become focused on enlargement, the more the merit-based kind of approach is going to prevail, there will be, especially now that we start talking about the next 7 years budget, the multi-annual financial framework, taxpayers in Europe are going to look very closely how this money is going to be distributed. And if we have a big pot that needs to go from one policy to enlargement, or for several policies to enlargement, like the common agricultural policy, like the cohesion policy, this is a big political decision. And so the only way for this to happen is if the merit-based approach is applied.
We'll come back, I think, to this theme throughout, but as we look at the desire of countries still to become part of the European Union and the promise that is, in the United States we talked for decades about the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, that we pushed through the Cold War era and embraced this unification in the sense of our institutions, stability, security, and for a more prosperous world. One of the exceptions to this, of course, was Brexit, which in 2016 caught the world, and I think even much of the UK, by surprise. Rob, we're almost a decade out from that. It's still a work in progress. Can you comment on how the UK and the EU are working through those very difficult feelings that were left by Brexit?
So you said a moment ago that the new government was elected in the UK in June this year, commanding majority, a very clear ambition to reset the relationship with the European Union, but also with our European partners as well. So both multilaterally and indeed at a bilateral level. And it's no mistake that you've seen a heavy program of engagement from the Prime Minister, Ursula von der Leyen, with multiple visits to Paris, to Berlin, to Rome, to Dublin, and more, I am sure, to come. And what's driving that, as I say, is an ambition to reset, to move the conversation on, to recognize that, no, we're not about to rejoin the European Union, we're not about to join the customs union or the single market again, but there are so many more things that we can do to drive economic growth, to lower some of those trade barriers, to aspire to SPS and veterinary agreements, which will make life so much easier for people trading right across Europe. But that we also need to respond, as I said, to some of those big headwinds that are coming our way and will continue to come our way through geopolitical competition, through the irregular migration challenge that we all face. So building pragmatic partnerships, sometimes across political divides, with our European partners, and indeed beyond, is what this government is all about. Which is why you will see, I think, intensified work to develop a security partnership between the UK and the EU. We are likely to see the UK-EU summit take place at some point in 2025. We've had the Foreign Secretary attending the Foreign Affairs Council to talk about Ukraine and some of the shared challenges. We are working incredibly closely together on Ukraine, on the Middle East, and I think you will find more of that going forward on a sort of a pragmatic basis. And alongside all of that, there is a real intent to intensify, as I say, those partnerships, capital to capital, where we can cross some of the political barriers, where we can be pragmatic, where we can have operational effect together on some of those big headwinds that have been coming our way. So that's what this government is all about, particularly in the context of its European policy. We have to work together if we are to support Ukraine, if we are to drive for peace in the Middle East, if we are to work together on the big interconnected challenges of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security, if we are to work with the new US administration to keep them engaged in European security, as well as working with them on Indo-Pacific as well. So this is the time to reset. This is the time to engage. And as part of that, we hope that that will lead to thriving in this context.
That sounds optimistic, and it brings in the multilateral aspect of Europe. It's not just the EU, but a broader spectrum of countries. David, you were Irish ambassador at the United Nations, perhaps our paramount multilateral organization, again, created out of the ashes of World War II, noble in aims, effective in many of the humanitarian and other tasks it undertakes, but considered by many to be failing the world now in terms of the great geopolitical challenges we have because of its structure. How do you see Europe, both in its EU context, but also in the broader geographic sense, engaging and playing a role at the UN moving forward, particularly with a new administration in the United States, as we heard last night, perhaps not a big fan of the EU or the UN?
I think we can drop the word perhaps. There is absolutely no doubt that the new US administration is a declared opponent of the UN and all the agreements and general improvements of humanity which the UN has been able to achieve. I would make a distinction between the Security Council, which, as you know, Philip, has particular rules which are an impediment in a way to progress, and the General Assembly, where it's possible to do more. Europe has punched above its weight at the UN, and in fact I'm fairly sure that there's a former good friend and colleague of mine in the audience who led the European Union delegation at the UN in my time. But Europe has undoubtedly been more than the sum of its member states at the UN, and I sincerely hope that that will prove to be the case over the coming years, where the UN itself is under greater threat than ever before. We've seen a proposed US ambassador to the UN who has made no secret of the fact that she favours reducing the US contribution, and that is, of course, the biggest nightmare that exists in relation to the UN, that a significant amount of the funding would be withheld, which of course would greatly reduce the ability of the UN to make a difference in any international arena.
Would Europe step up?
There, I couldn't speak for Europe, but I think, no, traditionally at the UN, the big financiers are the US, Japan, the Republic of Korea, those sort of players, and it's no doubt that'll have to be considered in due course. But the truth is that in terms of the rule of law, human rights, democracy, all these values that Europe stands for, you need a kind of a strong beacon at the UN, and that has traditionally been the European Union. So I think now more than ever that will be needed. Philip, if I may just simply to add a little bit to the previous conversation with Rob and indeed with René about a number of things. Brexit, since I come from Ireland, which was a country particularly affected by Brexit, we are hugely relieved that there is a pragmatic attitude on the part of the new British government, seen in various ways, renewed engagement. There will be, I gather, new institutions reflecting that. We also would feel that the European political community makes sense as a sort of an informal framework in which both the EU and a wider set of actors can cooperate. So in a way, it has always existed, in a manner of speaking, that kind of undeclared gathering of a wider group. But if it now meets more regularly, we would think it's a good thing. So I really just wanted to echo what indeed, and Vessela, what the three previous speakers were saying. I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's a great segue, because I wanted to come back to the EPC, the European Political Community, which of course was created, let's say, by President Macron. It was his idea, he's given credit for it. But one of the more recent meetings, one of the first things that the new Prime Minister in the UK did was host the EPC, a very good step, I think, in terms of looking at Europe not only surviving, but perhaps thriving in a broader geographical sense. René, do you want to add on the EPC and what its opportunities perhaps are? There are a few deliverables that seem to come out of it, but I think that's okay. I think it's important to have settings and structures that don't rely on set agendas or deliverables, but allow leaders to come together and discuss the key issues. That will be important for indeed thriving in this age. It's a flexible format. We just had the Budapest EPC summit that was somewhat overshadowed by the US elections, but what else came out of that, and what do you see the next steps of EPC being?
EPC is a flexible format. EPC is not the European Union. EPC is not an institution. EPC, it's a family meeting. All the family. We discuss, leaders discuss in a very, I would say, open-minded atmosphere. And what they discover, even though it's obvious, we belong to the same continent. And we share the same problems. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. But at least we discuss. And we offer, through this framework, kind of an umbrella for all of us to see what we have in common and how we can address the challenges. EPC is a baby, 2.5 years, but it's developing. I take note of the fact that for the next 3 summits of EPC, 2 of them are going to be held to happen in the Balkans, in Albania, and after Denmark, in Montenegro. There is a growing interest from this region for this format. EPC, of course, is not the answer to all the problems, but at least it means one thing, which is crucial. We can discuss among us, members of the European Union, non-members of the European Union, all belonging to the European continent. This is important, and this is also, because you said that the election of the US, the new US president, overshadowed the EPC meeting in Budapest. Yes and no. Yes, of course, but no, because the message is that, without, of course, being against, but we, against anyone in the US, but we have to be, concentrated, focused on our European challenges. And we belong to the same continent, whether we like it or not.
I think that's a very good point, and it brings us back from the opportunity for thriving, and EPC gives that family opportunity. When I was serving as the US interim ambassador in London, I often felt like a divorce counselor between my European friends and my UK friends, and I kept saying, we are all in one family. Now, some may begin to question on both sides of the Atlantic whether the US under a Trump 2.0 will be considered part of that family, but I think we have NATO and other things we can get into. But Vessela, let me come back perhaps with a little less optimistic view. There's a piece in the Washington Post yesterday, I believe, by Lee Hochstadter, an opinion piece, but he talks about the EU as struggling 20 Eurozone countries, but it remains deeply and self-defeatingly atomized despite 7 decades of striving for cohesion, starved for investment, hamstrung by regulation, a lack of innovation. You have the Donoghue report, which is a remarkable read. I won't suggest that I've gotten through the whole thing, but gives some recipes for a way forward. But indeed, does a Trump 2.0 galvanize Europe and impel those kinds of reforms that are going to be necessary, the kinds of things that Draghi suggests, or does it actually hasten decline? Your thoughts on that?
I try to be optimistic in the first round. I can attempt to stay there. However, I would admit that there is an array of problems that the EU is facing. The economic challenge being probably long-term the most serious one. And the Draghi report was doing exactly that, offering a recipe on how to bridge Europe's energy problem. In Europe, the price of energy is a third higher than in the US. No wonder there is kind of competitiveness issue there. And secondly, we do have an issue with research, development, innovation, and so on. But also with the financing, how we finance innovation.
Draghi suggests you need 850 billion euros to jumpstart the EU.
To jumpstart innovation. And there is one thing that you in America do very well: you can fail. You're allowed to fail. People are allowed to start.
I know that well.
An enterprise and fail. In Europe, it's very difficult, especially if you do it with EU money, to explain, to taxpayers that you give EU money for, enterprises to fail. But obviously, there is a need for much more private involvement, and I think the Draghi report is also pointing to that. The decision for Europe on the economic side is going to be driven really by a decision on the money, where to get the money from. Draghi was suggesting that we should borrow again the way we have done it through COVID. I think it's not, this is not going to be well accepted, especially in the so-called frugals. So the way
forward... There's been widespread opposition to, for instance, pooling public borrowing, even perhaps in defense?
I think defense is going to be key as well in terms of getting the money right, so to say. Piotr Serafin, the future budget commissioner, suggested during his hearing last week that we add the European tax that would go directly into the European budget, so that we may see already in 2025. And then the question is again how this money will be distributed. And this is ultimately a political decision. There will be an important election in Europe happening, an early election again, on the 23rd of February in Germany. Depending on how the German economy works and how it develops, Europe may find or not find easily its way out of this sort of economic stagnation. But I believe still that the challenges are so great, especially on security and defense and on tech and innovation, that a big effort is needed, and this is also what von der Leyen is going to try to do. The question is how much room the member states are going to leave for her.
And interesting to remember that every year about $320 billion in European savings goes to the United States and is invested because of innovation. And
a third of the startups go to the US, yes.
Yeah. Rob, maybe we come back to you with suggestions, as the article I referenced, that Europe is unready for a trade war with the Trump administration and with Trump himself, as David said, hostile to the very idea of Europe, certainly the EU. And he said our own allies treat us worse than our enemies in terms of, and I quote, screwing us on trade. The EU has been preparing for tit for tat on tariffs, a word that President-elect Trump has said is one of the best words. Tom Countryman spoke a bit about that last night and what that could mean for inflation and what tariffs really do. But how do you think the UK is prepared, again, as part of Europe but not in the EU, for a potential trade war and this whole issue of the economic side of this future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two dimensions worth sort of touching on here. I mean, clearly in the context of our trade relationship with the United States, we have an incredibly close trade relationship with the United States. The extent to which UK investment is involved in supporting, creating jobs right across the United States, and indeed vice versa, is often hugely underestimated. I think the other thing that is really important is the extent to which our innovation and R&D economies are deeply intertwined, perhaps more so than other parts of the continent with the United States. So clearly the conversation with the United States is going to be about how do we grow that? How do we develop that further? How do you build that partnership in tech and innovation and trade that is so clearly in the mutual interests of both the United Kingdom and indeed the United States? I think the other dimension that's just worth pausing on this is the importance of keeping the United States engaged in Euro-Atlantic security. Mm-hmm. And the challenge that, and you reflect some of the comments that have been made by the President-elect, the challenge that we all face is demonstrating to our US partners that they remain the fundamental guarantors of European security in partnership with European allies, but that in order to sustain that and secure that, we need to contribute. We need to contribute more, we need to do that in better ways, and that we need to be slightly careful of the conversation about strategic autonomy, because yes, we need to build capability, yes, we need to invest, but we need to be careful that our own fear about the United States walking away doesn't itself create the circumstances for disengagement. We need to be quite careful that as we are looking to develop capability, that capability remains interoperable through NATO with our US partners, so that they absolutely remain engaged as the key guarantor of Euro-Atlantic security. Then very finally, we need to be clear as Europeans how far we are prepared to contribute to the Indo-Pacific security challenges as well. Because for many of us, the US included, this is not an either-or. These things have to be seen as integrated as a whole. And the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine with Korean forces, etc., demonstrate the proof positive of that concept that Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security is intertwined. And we need to work together on both sets of challenges.
It's a great segue to what I'll make the final question for the panel, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. And that's to segue to China. Yeah. As you mentioned, you have Asian soldiers from North Korea literally on the doorstep of NATO, the European Union, and the implications of that reminds us that NATO included China as a challenge in its new strategic concept. That was controversial for some, but I think we've certainly heard from former and President-elect Trump's view that China is a top priority, and I think the look at Europe will often begin in a geopolitical sense at how Europe is responding to China. It was an issue of great discord during the first Trump administration. Let me just go to each of you, and we'll start with David. Your thoughts on how Europe is doing in terms of responding to China, the lure of cheap money, of easy projects, belts and roads, which some, like Italy, have said, wait a minute, that isn't the direction we want to go. Quickly, for each of you, in about a minute each, China and EU in this geopolitical age, China and Europe.
I think Europe will try to position itself cleverly in relation to China. It has all the economic interests and potential cooperation, which you allude to, Philip. But on the other hand, it must perceive China as a possible threat in relation to its own security. I say possible because officially China is declaring that it will not, or is indicating that it will not support Russia directly in its military adventurism in Ukraine. That's my phrase. But on the other hand, one can interpret...
A friendship with no boundaries.
Precisely, one can interpret the North Korean angle in various ways. So China, possible threat. Europe has to be wary of that. On the other hand, it will try to preserve as positive as possible a relationship with China and not go in for overt confrontation as the US is never likely to.
China certainly, though, as the NATO communique made clear, enabling this quite determinedly, Russia's attack against Ukraine.
Yeah, that's NATO. Yeah.
Vessela.
I believe that was the turning point in a way in some Europeans' thinking about China, because there was the conviction that we can trade with China and, you know, support Ukraine, and those two things do not contradict each other. But actually, what we find out is that Chinese involvement in that particular war is actually quite important. I believe also, and I agree with you, that that our policy towards China can be the leverage that we need vis-a-vis Trump, and that we could use. There is a shift in the public opinion in Europe on China, also in terms of the economic opportunity it provides, especially when you look at the German debate. The German car makers are extremely, have profited a lot from being on the Chinese market. Now they see that this is becoming kind of a peril for them. And I believe further down the road, there will be a sort of a policy that provides security for our green tech, for our automotive industry, especially the electric cars. But also, we need a joint policy on AI, and there the US and the UK are going to be critical.
So our Prime Minister met President Xi yesterday, which is the first meeting between a British Prime Minister and Chinese Premier for 6 plus years. And you know, that's driven by, I think, 2 or 3 things that are going to be really important going through all of this. That desire to cooperate, you know, the extent to which our economies are intertwined and reliant upon batteries, on solar, is huge. US 60% tariffs on China will have an enormous impact upon the European economy and the European green transition, including in our country. But we're also going to need to challenge as well. We're going to need to contest where we do disagree, which means I think that Europe is going to need to be, and include the UK in this, that we're going to need to be credible on the Indo-Pacific, the China security challenges, the AI challenges as well. We need to be very careful that we don't become boxed in just on the European security and economic dimension at the moment, because of the sheer interconnectedness of these challenges, not only driven by actors in the region, but also driven by a policy of a new US administration. So it is in our interests to engage, to contest, but also to cooperate in a very kind of clear-eyed manner with China as we go through this next phase.
René, final word on China, and audience will then turn to you.
Well, we more than ever live in a global world. China is a major player. Sometimes we can antagonize China. Sometimes we don't share the same values. Sometimes we cooperate. There are global issues you cannot solve without China.
Climate.
So we have to find the ways, and this is what we're working for. Our authorities, our president, he recently, some months ago, received in Paris President Xi in France. We have to be, as it has been said, not to be naive and to be ready for addressing the challenge of what China represents in today's world, but also to be open to find the ways of cooperating with China to address global challenges.
Of course, President Xi also visiting here in Belgrade. So China, an important factor in this question of surviving and thriving. The first hand I see is the lady here.
Hi, Leonita Bayrami, journalist at Top Channel. I have some question for Mr. Troccaz regarding to the Kosovo and Serbia relations. France is a sponsor of the latest agreement between the two parties, a special sponsor in this case, to which both parties are not doing very much to implement that agreement, the Brussels agreement that was from last year. Regarding to that, there has been some serious, as we see, violations from Serbia. We recall the attack on the KFOR soldiers, on the last year, also the terrorist attack on the 24th of September. Also, last year, I would like to ask, why is that being tolerated at this point by the EU? Because we are here talking about the Western Balkans to uphold the
Let's go
EU.
with a question on Serbia-Kosovo from an EU perspective and how that relates to surviving and thriving in this geopolitical age.
We have a framework for that. It's a point of sensitivity. We need to normalize. We're working with both sides in order to facilitate the dialogue. This is why precisely the European Union, as you know, has this so-called Brussels-Ohrid agreement, which is, again, a framework where the two sides are, with the help of the European Union, discussing to overcome the difficulties. We know what these difficulties are. So what we call for is both sides to refrain from any damaging unilateral measures. You mentioned some of them. This is where we are. What we have to say is that precisely because, as said before, for us the goal and the answer to this problem is the European integration, we need to progress on the dialogue within this framework, the European facilitated framework. Second, we need, again, to refrain from any unilateral measures. And third, we need, of course, to help both sides to find the ways of an agreement, of a solution. We know it's not easy. We know that. What you're mentioning, all these different points, I know. But this is where we are, and we don't have to leave this way and this framework. For us, this is the main answer.
Sir, here, second row, third row. Yes, please wait for the mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jason McCarthy, Irish Serbian Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. However, my question will be directed specifically at Mr. Donoghue. So, during your time as ambassador to Russia, and also as one of the fathers, basically, of the Good Friday Agreement, what would be your thoughts about the conflict resolution between Russia and Ukraine?
Excellent.
In 2 minutes.
Wonderful question, and
we finally get a headline.
Ultimately, they say that all conflicts end at the negotiating table, but that does not mean that I think that I see an early path to the negotiating table in the case of Ukraine. We were fortunate in Northern Ireland that we were able to get the parties around a table at the right time and with the right approach, and dare I say it, with two prime ministers who were equally determined to find a solution and who worked well together. So we had a lot going for us. I don't see the same circumstances at present in relation to Ukraine. But I mean, more seriously, I suppose we all want to see the earliest possible end to military conflict per se. It's simply just that it's not easy to imagine what would be a just settlement in the present circumstances.
And worth remembering that the Good Friday Accords, the Belfast Agreement, had a certain American spirit about it.
The US dimension was extremely valuable for the Good Friday Agreement, and there's no secret about that. So we had a benign third party which was actively involved behind the scenes. One could imagine certain benign third parties in relation to Russia and Ukraine, but we're really some distance off that at the moment.
Trying to go from this side, the gentleman there, and then the lady in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Wouter Zweers. I'm from the Klingendael Institute in the Netherlands. I have a question for Mr. Troccaz, who was arguing that EU enlargement is key, including with Serbia. And many of us have the impression that in EU enlargement, the EU approach sometimes rather follows the interests of lithium mining, of short-term stability, rather than the merit-based approach. In the time to come, real decisions need to be made, for example, on opening Cluster 3. So I was wondering how you feel about EU conditionality, merit-based conditionality towards Serbia specifically. Thank you.
The merit-based approach is valid for all the candidates, from Ukraine to Serbia, from Bosnia to North Macedonia, etc. So this is one thing. This is the European rule. And this is not to be, how can I say that, to sanction the people or to be strict with them, but this is because we need coherence among our European club. That's one thing. The second thing, do we have interests? We do. But I guess we're not the only ones in the world. Maybe also the Americans have some interest. I don't know. You should ask them. And third, do we see compatibility between these interests, between what we're promoting and the European way of these countries? And namely, you mentioned the case of Serbia. Of course. Of course, we think it will be, and this is what my president, when here, he visited Belgrade some weeks ago, stated very clearly, for us, the future of Serbia is in the European Union, is in the European family. This is why and what we are working for, and also, precisely, because you mentioned it also, trying to find ways to allow the possibility to integrate or to solve this question of to open the cluster 3, which is something a little bit technical, but we think that we have to work hard on that.
And the lady here had the next question.
Hi, I'm Valbona Bitucci, a journalist at Coavision Kosovo.
Sorry, well, please go ahead, but I had given the floor to the lady here in the front row.
Okay.
Finish your question.
Okay. Kosovo continues to be under the EU measures since last year, even though it has fully fulfilled the requirements from the Bratislava agreement. Mr. Borrell has submitted a report which it requires to lifting the measures against Kosovo. My question is, does France, how I can say, support the lifting of measures against Kosovo, and what will be your state vote if it comes to the voting process? Thank you.
René, do you want to?
Sorry, I have to say that I had the impression that it was a panel.
Exactly.
It becomes kind of a
this isn't a France
interview, but I think I
Kosovo-Serbia panel. So let's please, ma'am, here in the front row. The front row. Thank you. And please tell me it's not another Kosovo-Serbia question.
No, not at all. Ana Jovanovska from North Macedonia. I just wanted, let's say, to hear the opinion of whoever feels competent to answer this. In 2018, the topic of having a European army as a complement to NATO was brought by Ms. Merkel and Mr. Macron. Do you think now that with the ongoing geopolitical happenings, maybe it's a mature timing to have these developments happen?
There's a good question. Why don't we go around and each offer any thoughts on that? David, you start.
I'll jump in a little bit defensively, if you forgive me. I'm from Ireland, and so we're not a member of NATO. But on the other hand, we do try to cooperate on issues of security and defence with the rest of the EU. Yes, there has been talk for quite some time past of a single European army, but defence in a strict sense is within the competence of each member state. So I could imagine closer coordination between armies, plural as it were, but I think some of us might hesitate at the notion of creating a single European army. But it is a genuine topic for debate, and it has been, of course, revived against the background of the strategic autonomy discussion. But Ireland will be one of the more cautious countries about it, though not necessarily preventing progress.
Vessela?
I will call for a bit more realism here, because we do understand that in Europe there is a shift towards more sovereignist kind of approach at national level. and we saw this at the last European Parliament elections. This is going to, if we start talking about European army now, this is going to create more of a problem than bring a solution, I believe, simply for political reasons. What we should be doing is really, first of all, start with the coordination of our defense industries, how we procure, what we procure, where do we get the money for it, what are the European programs out there that are able to create European defense to an extent that is at least satisfying for the current circumstances, and maybe after that kind of embark on a more ambitious agenda. But we are always thinking about it, I believe, currently at least, in the realm of the European pillar of NATO, which is kind of the more doable goal.
Interoperability, obviously, a key component,
Yes.
and as you say, procurement, important.
I'm just flagging that putting a label that can be very controversial politically may create more problems than bring solutions.
Yeah. Rob?
So we're not in the EU, but we are engaged with our European partners, our European NATO partners, on shared defence endeavours. So the UK is the lead nation for the Joint Expeditionary Force in the High North, in the Baltic, across the Nordic region as well, where we have UK forces deployed, where we train and operate and exercise. That is the model, I think, for the future of bringing allies together to develop practical forms of cooperation and indeed interoperability. Because if you don't train together, if you don't procure together, actually trying to do interoperability when you really need it is incredibly difficult. And that's why things like the future of procurement models in Europe have to leave open the door for non-European partners to make sure that kit and capability is swappable and can be used in real time in real situations.
René?
In a couple of words, no, we need a European pillar in NATO. We have to work for that. We have to work more. You asked the question about the European army. Probably we're not yet there, but the goal is to get a greater autonomy, procurement, the way we interact between our armies, and again, because we are facing the same challenges. History may change, geography will not.
Yeah. That's a marvelous way to end. I would only add that from a US perspective, we also look at the EU with sectors like financial services, telecoms, energy, all of them still 27 separate markets. So a lot of areas to work on. As a believer in the EU, I say that I think European pillar, but NATO has come a long way in addressing this and has been so crucial to European security, particularly now. I think that's a marvelous point to end, not only for surviving, but indeed we've heard some opportunities for thriving. Europe, not just the EU, but Europe, geography matters. And I want to thank everyone, particularly my panelists, and the Belgrade Security Council for hosting us, conference for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.